Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I know the intention of my friends on the other side of the aisle. We all want the country to run at maximum peak performance so that people have jobs. But it's interesting the ways we have about going about trying to see that that happens. Interesting, in fact, we got the president's budget yesterday. Of course, it took 2 months or so beyond what the law says that the president must do. We also know that when it comes to people being in the country illegally, the president decided that he didn't like the laws that were passed by Congresses of the past, both Democrat and Republican, signed into law by presidents, both Democrat and Republican. And so President Obama got up and did what you don't normally find in a country with representative government. He just announced, I don't like the law the way it is, so here's the new law, and basically pronounced new law into being with regard to who will be allowed to have amnesty in the country, and that program has already started. In the past, the founders' intent was well carried out, because I've been advised by people who worked here in Democratic majorities as Democratic leaders and Republican leaders of the past who said, yes, in the past, if you had a president stand up and say, I'm choosing to ignore the law that has been passed by prior Congresses, signed into being by other presidents, I'm going to ignore those and just pronounce new law. So as I say it, so shall it be. If you had a president that acted like that, then both Democratic and Republican leaders would get together and they would head down Pennsylvania Avenue that way, and they would announce themselves and let the president know that either he would begin to comply with the law and stop doing what is solely the responsibility of Congress, or they would cut off all funding to everything he cared about, and that would take care of it. Unfortunately, these days, the president, those in power in the White House and the executive branch have noted that since the Democratic Party is the majority in the Senate, then even when there are enough people in the Republican Party in the House who have the nerve to stand up and say, we will no longer allow violations of the law or creations of law out of whole cloth without following the Constitution, the Senate would stop those actions because they're not going to let anything like that pass the Senate. And therefore, we have bureaucrats who begin to announce to elected members of this government that they really don't care what we have to say, that we're not going to stop them from doing whatever they want because the Senate will block anything we try to do here at the House. Because this is a divided Capitol building with the Senate in a majority of Democratic hands and the House in Republican majority control, it is very important that we note what the other branch, the presidency, is pronouncing. Under the president's proposed budget, there is an article here, April 10th, from CNS News. It says, the OMB historical tables have revealed the White House does not expect this administration to ever run an annual deficit as low as $458.5 billion, which was the deficit the government ran in fiscal 2008, the last fiscal year completed before Obama took office. It's also important to note that in 2006, the last year Republicans were in control of the House, we were properly ridiculed by Democrats on this side of the aisle because we ran a $160 billion or so budget, spending over the amount that was coming in. that we had $160 billion in deficit spending, and the Democrats were correct. We should not have had $160 billion in deficit spending, having no idea that the promises from the friends on this side of the aisle who said if will just put us in the majority, we'll cut that $160 billion deficit spending the Republicans have done, and we will get a balanced budget. We won't deficit spend. Who would have believed that when they took over as a majority, that within 2 years they would have basically tripled the amount of deficit spending, so much for the promise that we're going to cut deficit spending. So the $160 billion or so went to $458.5 billion, about triple the deficit. And then who could have possibly imagined that during President Obama's first year in office, when Democratic control was of both the House and the Senate, that they would have the nerve to not run a $160 billion deficit, as they said they would never do, or the $458 billion deficit, nearly 3 times as much as 2008, but that they would go 10 times that amount of $160 billion and hit about $1.6 trillion in deficit spending. I mean, there are several markers being laid down in this country that make it very clear that this country is on a crash course. There are no seat belts. There are no harnesses. There are no airbags. We are barreling down this road to a definite end unless we get this thing under control. And for the president to propose, for the first time in American history, before he leaves office in 2017, under the president's proposed budget, he will preside over the spending of $4.0898 trillion in fiscal year 2016. It's unbelievable. We've got somewhere between $2.3, $2.5 trillion that is expected to be coming in to the Treasury this year. And the president's proposing $3.8 trillion in spending. It is outrageous. And at the same time, the president, he's closed down tours. There's no indication that there's actually been even $18,000 or $74,000 or $78,000 in savings from not having White House tours. So you begin to wonder, well, now wait a minute. You said it was to save all this money. It was the reason you cut out White House tours, that it wasn't just a temper tantrum to make people suffer. So let's see, where's the savings? And if there's no Secret Service being furloughed, there's no Secret Service being laid off, it would appear there's no savings. So what then could have possibly been the purpose for saying no more White House tours? It actually, some have said, well, you know, Congress is just mad because it complicates their job. And those are people saying those types of things that really have no clue what's going on in Washington, because the fact is, a member of Congress's life, be it Democrat or Republican, is actually less complicated when you don't have to arrange for White House tours. It's something that members of Congress have been on voluntarily in order to help the White House. So we would make the arrangements. People would call and come through our office. Then we'd have to write, request, beg the White House, can you find enough tickets for these individuals to allow them to go through the White House? And then we would get word back, and the president first started because we had trouble getting tickets for anybody the first year or so, which meant that the president got to have people furious with members of Congress because they blame members of Congress for not being able to go through the White House on a tour when actually we would just get notice and only be able to pass that on. So it actually makes members of Congress's life far less complicated when we don't have to arrange for White House tours. But the members of Congress I know on both the Democratic side and the Republican side really want to enhance visits from their constituents to Washington, D.C., and so we're willing to spend part of our budget to help have somebody help arrange those tours for constituents coming to Washington. We help the White House by doing that. And even though our offices, every congressional budget has been cut about 20% over the last 3 years, we haven't cut out those constituent services. We have one person less in my office. We just didn't replace by attrition. But we've had to make adjustments. And I'm grateful to have a staff that's willing to work hard and long hours. They don't get paid overtime. But they're willing to do that because they realize this is a servant's job. I am a servant. People that work in my office are servants. And we serve the public and serve at their will. Apparently, that is not something that all bureaucrats have been able to understand and take to heart. Then we also see big news today that a gun bill has cleared the Senate hurdle as the filibuster falls short. This is a FoxNews.com story that was released today. And it is worth noting that another story here indicates Senator Lee says background checks could allow Holder, the Attorney General, to create gun registry using regulations. In fact, on Wednesday, it says Senator Mike Lee, Republican from Utah, fantastic senator that he is. That's a parenthetical insertion, but he took to the Senate floor and warned that universal background checks could lead to a national registry system for guns. A quote from a friend, Senator Lee, is, quote, some of the proposals, like, for example, universal background checks, would allow the federal government to surveil law-abiding citizens who exercise their constitutional rights. One of the provisions we expect to see in the bill, based on what we saw in the Judiciary Committee, on which I sit, would allow the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, to promulgate regulations that could lead to a national registry system for guns, something my constituents in Utah are very concerned about and understandably, unquote, Senator Lee. Lee also said that the government had no place monitoring the legal exercise of any constitutional right a citizen chooses to exercise. Quote, you see, the federal government has no business monitoring when or how often you go to church, what books and newspapers you read, who you vote for, your health conditions, and actually I have to differ with Senator Lee on health conditions. Obamacare means the government gets to monitor all your health conditions and actually will have all of your health care records as well. Senator Lee goes on, what you eat for breakfast and the details of your private life, including your lawful exercise of your rights protected by the Second Amendment and other provisions of the Bill of Rights. Important quotes by Senator Mike Lee. With regard to the gun bill that's been rushed through the Senate, it is worth noting again that when bills are rushed through without being given proper scrutiny, we create bad laws, we make mistakes, and the country suffers. And the Constitution suffers. It's part of our oath that we will protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. And I would humbly submit we don't do that job when we rush through bills that people have not had a chance to read, to participate in. And as my friends know, I have, on this very floor, read quotes from Minority Leader John Boehner, who in essence told Major Garrett that if we get back to authority, a Speaker, John Boehner, will bring bills through regular order. I'm not going to rush them to the floor like Speaker Pelosi has done. And I've had to remind my own leadership of those promises because we keep rushing through bills as Republicans that people do not have enough time to read. And I'm hoping and praying and arguing, cajoling to try to make sure we stop that process and that we return to regular order. There's some bad bills that come out of regular order, to be sure. But when we have full debate at a subcommittee level over a proposed bill, and any member of that subcommittee, this is called regular order, any member of that subcommittee can bring an amendment to any provision in that bill, you get some scrutiny of the bill in its entirety. And then when we have a markup at the full committee level, and any member, Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they're on or not on any of the subcommittees. At the full committee, any member of the full committee can bring an amendment to that bill. We took most of the day today marking up a pretty simple bill, I thought, on the issue of reining in over-regulation and getting Congress to take a look at the tens of thousands of pages of regulations that come out so regularly from bureaucrats that never see or catch the eye of elected officials. It's a pretty simple bill. It took hours and hours to go through that because there were so many proposed amendments. And each amendment that gets made has a chance for the proponent to argue for at least 5 minutes in favor of his amendment. And then under the rules, any member of the committee can spend up to 5 minutes on each amendment. And it's not a pretty process. It's not pleasant to sit through. But we get better bills when we go through that process. And then it comes through the Rules Committee, and I prefer if the Rules Committee is really going to allow fully open debate. We have an open amendment process. It's not pretty either. But it gives people across America a chance to see who is advocating for what amendment, what language. And you have had all this time from the subcommittee to the committee to the House floor, and every member of the House, no matter who you are or no matter whether you're in disfavor with the leadership like some of us may be, you can bring amendments in an open process under regular order. And you have a chance to debate those. And America has a chance to see who's standing for what positions. And it gives them a chance at the next election to better select who they want representing them by virtue of what positions they're taking. But when it goes through the process, it just did through the Senate, there's not proper scrutiny. And things come to the floor and we're not sure what the impact is. And it can get so ridiculous that you could even have a Speaker of the House say, look, we're going to have to pass this bill before we can find out what's in it. That's not the way we're supposed to govern. We have an obligation to do better than that. Now, we've also gotten word that from the sequester that hit here just recently, this is an article by Elizabeth Harrington dated April 9th this week. Safe from sequester, $704,198 for gardening at NATO ambassador's home. Well, that should be a nice garden, as I used to, nor does my wife, but I'm pretty sure that the gorgeous yard we have didn't cost $704,198 on our property. So you would have thought that perhaps if people were going to help the president that are in the president's administration, they go, hey, heck, I can make do on $200,000 for my yard work this year. So you can get another $500,000 back right there, and gee, just think of all the White House tours that would fund, even though it doesn't look like the cutting of the tours actually saved anything. And then we have some very salient points made by Investors.com titled 6 Ways Obama's Budget is Worse Than Everyone Thinks. It's posted 4/10/2013. Fiscal policy. Shorn of its accounting gimmicks, the president's budget isn't a balanced plan to get the debt crisis under control. It's a monument to fiscal irresponsibility. With much fanfare and a lot of media hype, President Obama unveiled his latest budget plan 2 months late. An IBD review of Obama's budget finds that, among other things, it, first, boosts spending and deficits over the next 2 years. Obama's own budget numbers show that he wants to hike spending over the next 2 years by $247 billion compared with the baseline, which even after his proposed new tax hikes would mean $157 billion in additional red ink. And it's important to understand, and I insert this parenthetically here, when we talk about a baseline, yes, the bill I've been pushing for 8 years, a zero baseline budget where no federal department has automatic increases, did pass the House a year ago, and I'm very grateful to Rob Woodall and Paul Ryan and the Speaker keeping his word and bringing it to the floor. We passed it in the House, but the Senate under Senator Reid made clear, no, we want every department in the federal bureaucracy having an automatic increase in their budget every year. We want their budgets going up every year. Now, Social Security, they may not get an automatic increase. Medicare, they may be cut $700 billion as they were under Obamacare. But when it comes to every federal bureaucracy, Senator Reid made clear they were not going to pass a zero baseline budget. They were not going to do away with the automatic increases. They were going to push forward and make sure the government bloat, the government just obesity as a bureaucracy would continue. And there would be automatic increases in every single federal budget. So, when this article points out that the president adds to the baseline, it means the president is already adding to what has been an automatic increase in their budgets for every department already. I hope that eventually, may take another election to get people that are thinking correctly in the Senate, who will finally stand up and say, whether Democrat or Republican, you know what? There isn't an individual, there's not a family, there's not a charity, there's not a business anywhere in America that has an automatic increase every year in their budget, so we're stopping it for the government. If an agency or a department wants an increase, they're going to have to come in and justify it. Now, some of us wouldn't mind starting every year with a zero sum, and you have to justify anything that you get at all. But all the zero baseline does is say, we are willing to start where we were last year, and if you need an increase, we'll increase. And that way, when those of us conservatives that advocate for a decrease in the increase actually are still allowing for an increase, we aren't vilified for making draconian cuts because the increases are still there. If we can get to a zero baseline, then you will actually be able to have honest and accurate criticism, because at that point, a cut would actually be a cut. It would not be a decrease in the automatic increase. But President Obama, not content with the overspending and the waste, fraud, and abuse that's going on, is adding even above the automatic increases with his budget. This article from Investors.com says vastly exaggerates spending cuts. The press has widely reported that Obama's budget would cut spending a total of $1.2 trillion over the next decade. But Obama's own budget shows that he actually cut spending a mere $186 billion. The relevant tables can be found, and it gives www.whitehouse.gov cites default files OMB budget 2014 assets tables.pdf. But Obama inflates his claimed savings by first canceling the automatic sequester spending cuts he previously signed into law, then reclaiming them as new savings. I didn't realize that went on, actually. But by adding in cuts in interest payments on the debt. Article says it relies almost entirely on tax hikes. Obama's budget shows his plan would increase revenues $1.14 trillion over the next decade. That means his budget proposes $6 in new taxes for every $1 in spending cuts. It cuts the deficit less than claimed. My budget will, and this is a quote from the president, my budget will reduce our deficits by nearly another $2 trillion, unquote. Obama said Wednesday. But this budget shows total deficit reduction over the next decade would be just $1.4 trillion, plus deficits start rising again after 2018. And it should be noted that CBO does not have a good grasp on reality. I've met with Director Elmendorf. I've talked to him more than once. I appreciate the job they're trying to do. But when they estimate the cost of Obamacare at $800 billion, and then after it passes, say, whoops, maybe $1.1 trillion, and then after it's almost coming into effect, you know what, it could be $1.6 trillion or $1.8 trillion, and then others more accurately say, you know what, it may be $2.8 trillion. That means if they originally estimate $800 billion, and it ends up being $2.8 trillion, then they've got a margin of error rate of plus or minus, not 1, 2, 3, or 4%, but more like 300 to 400%. Why are we even considering CBO projections when they're projecting costs with a margin of error of 300 to 400%? I think you'd have better luck just bringing somebody right out of college in here and say, you give us your guess. Surely your margin of error will be closer than 300 or 400%. Anyway, Investors.com points out that Obama's budget, quote, creates a new entitlement without reliable means to pay for it. Obama claims he can finance a new $76 billion, quote, preschool for all, unquote, program by raising tobacco taxes again. But after initial spike, tobacco tax revenues will start trending downward year after year as more people quit smoking, while the cost of this new program will keep climbing. The last time Obama hiked tobacco taxes to pay for an expansion of Medicaid, revenues came in $2.2 billion less than expected. So apparently, if the president wants more revenue from smoking, he's going to need to start doing a campaign to encourage people to smoke more so that he can get more taxes in and bring down the massive deficit that he is wanting to create. And this report points out from Investors.com, the president boosts taxes on the middle class. Obama proposed to change the government's consumer price index in a way that will lower the official inflation rate. He's selling it as a way to cut social cost of living adjustments, which are based on the CPI. But because his changed CPI would also apply to annual tax bracket adjustments, It will end up hiking taxes on the middle class, $124 billion. The American people deserve better, and I hope and pray the Senate will wake up, come to their senses, and stop trying to ram legislation through that America does not deserve. With that, I yield back.